All right, Anna. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. We'll love to get started. And if you could just give the audience a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to where you're at today.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm Anna Taylor. I am the Director of Global Talent Acquisition for Semperis. We're a cybersecurity company. We're the leader in hybrid identity protection. And I think if someone were to look at my LinkedIn profile, they'd probably think to themselves, like, how did this person get that job? But basically, the way I got here is by a lot of startup work. So right out of college, I worked for a really small organization that was owned by a couple, actually. And I quickly got to do a little bit of everything. When you're that small, you really get to get your hands dirty and get involved in absolutely everything, all aspects of the business. And recruiting has always been a piece of it. I then moved on from there to a family-owned business and eventually found myself in tech, but always in these very small organizations where I would get to do everything and anything that you could imagine and wear many different hats working directly with the owners. So, ultimately I ended up being introduced to Semperis by kind of a friend of a friend. And recruiting has always been a piece of what I've done. So I thought, that's what I can contribute to this small business. At the time, we were about 140 employees. So I thought, okay, great, my sweet spot again. And, here I am. And I never imagined we would be as big as we are, but now we're at 500. And I've gotten to specialize in, something that's always been a part of my career anyway. So it's been really fun.
Wow, that is an incredible amount of growth. How long have you been with the company?
I've been here since January of 2022. So I'm starting my 4th year.
Wow. So from 140 to 500 in just a few years. And when you started, were you strictly brought in for talent acquisition, or were you focusing on broader HR as well?
That's a great question. So typically in other experiences, I was brought in for broader HR or operations, and recruiting ended up being kind of just a piece of it. But here at Semperis, we very consciously brought me on just for talent acquisition. So that was always going to be my focus, is just talent acquisition. And it has really remained that way as well, because we have a fairly robust, people operations team.
Yep. And when you were brought in, were there plans to scale as much as you guys did?
Wow, no. Not that I was aware of. Maybe somebody else knew we would. But when I was brought in, it was January that year, and I thought we were going to hire, maybe 80 people throughout the year, which would have been a lot, right? That would have been like still kind of a really big size of hiring. But then in May of 2022, we actually received our Series C $200 million funding round. And suddenly it was, all right, Anna, go hire a few more recruiters. We're going to really do this thing. And we doubled that number and just hit the ground running.
Wow. Well, yeah, a $200 million Series C will definitely be a catalyst for us in hiring. So how did you, if that was in January, so first of all, you're brand new to the role. And then in May, it's like, here we go. We've got all this funding. We need to go hire people to hire people. How did that, obviously that changed probably what some of your priorities were at the time. What was your approach? I mean, that's like a pretty big ask mid-year to somebody that's, 5 months in.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the roles I've had leading up to that kind of helped me because often the approach is just to tackle one thing at a time, right? It's just slow it all down, everything that's happening around you, and tackle it just one part at a time. And so while I'm trying to build my own team, I'm also holding a full rec load, right? And trying to help hiring managers and things like that. But I knew that we had to slow down and kind of pause before any of us would be able to be successful at that. So I decided to really take a step back and look at the company as a whole, get to know as many hiring managers as I could. In my first 30 days at Semperis, I think I booked myself, one-on-ones with almost every single manager that we had at the company, including all the way up to CEO, right? And I just wanted to know everybody. I wanted to know everything about everything. And then I created a process. And so I put together like a very quick kind of slide deck that showed, these are the steps we're going to try and follow so that we can all stay organized and on the same page with the amount of volume that you all need. And I did sort of a roadshow, in a way you could call it, with all the managers where I presented that to them. And I said, when you're ready to recruit and when it's kind of your turn, to work with my team, this is how it's going to look and this is what we're going to do. And we were all sort of holding each other's hands through it. A lot of these managers were similar situation to me where they also didn't expect to have grown, to 10 on their team that year, but they did. And so we sort of had to help each other through it. But that's the only way to go, right? Like take it one step at a time. set the framework so that then you can manage through the speed and chaos that you have to get through.
Yeah, I absolutely love that approach. I think, first of all, the fact that in your first 30 days, you did all of those meetings with hiring managers just to get to know them and for them to get to know you is a great way of building trust. But I love the approach of building that standardized playbook for how we're going to hire, because I think the challenge is with hiring managers is they're hiring intermittently throughout the year. Like you said, many of them probably didn't expect to grow their team in the way that they had to grow their team after you guys raised the Series C. So all of a sudden, hiring managers are thrusted into a need where they have to hire for their team, whether it's for growth or for a backfill or whatever. And since many of them may have not hired in so long, they need some like core hiring principles to fall back on. So you're not starting from scratch with every single hiring manager when you're going from, 140 to 500 plus, people in a matter of a few years. How over time, that's obviously things you did right when you started and you developed a really good framework. Over time, though, how do you maintain that continuity with your hiring managers to make sure they don't lose that muscle or that comprehension of how you guys hire? So when it is time for them to hire again, they can jump right back on the saddle and be a great partner for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it has been difficult because not only have all the teams grown really big, but we've also gotten new managers. So every time a new manager comes on board, I take time to kind of introduce myself to them. Often I'm the one that hired them, so that's kind of easy. And then I'll tell them the framework. I share a lot of things that we've refined throughout the years as to, the different forms that I'll need you to fill out so that we make sure we get everything right. And then every single role starts with a super personalized kickoff conversation. So if there's anything that person missed, maybe we haven't hired for them in 6 months, they're going to get it all refreshed again in that kickoff conversation, or some companies call it the intake call. Our, intake call is not just a list of questions, right? We're really understanding what that hiring manager needs, really digging into the profile for the candidate, but then in turn, educating them a little bit on our process and what we are going to offer throughout.
So it sounds like your intake is a bit of you educating them or refreshing them on the type of process that you aim to run. And it's also, in reverse, where they're educating you on what they're looking for, what they need in the role. How do you guys collaborate, though, if it's a brand new role, somebody the hiring manager has never hired before, somebody that you guys as a company haven't recruited before? How do you figure out what that ideal candidate profile looks like together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually just recently went through this, and we've gone through it a few times because as the company has grown, we've had to expand globally into some markets that I've personally never even recruited in before. So like very recently, we started hiring in Brazil, for example. That's a very, very recent position. And I have a recruiter that's been with me for over 3 years, like almost the same amount of time that I've been here. And I super trusted her with that position. She just jumped right in, learned the market, did some research, did a lot of sourcing, and just kind of had conversations. And that's always what we do. I know it's time consuming, but it's all about having conversations with people who live in the market, getting to know the hiring managers a little bit better, and looking for expertise wherever you can. So there's only so much research you can do online. I always think the best thing is to actually get on a call with someone, right? Open that Zoom, book a time, even if the candidate's not the right fit. Every single time you talk to someone, you're going to learn more and more about that new market, or you're going to learn more and more about that specific position. And then as a recruiter, the next time you need to recruit for that role, you're going to be super ready. So that's kind of the method. Yes, it's kind of time consuming, a lot of these things that we do, but it's important time. It's valuable time.
Yep. And that makes a lot of sense. And so you start having these conversations, early on in the hiring process for these new roles. What's the cadence then like with the hiring manager? So you guys are recalibrating and making sure you're looking for, that right type of profile, because I have to imagine that you start some hiring processes, you have your first 5 to 10 conversations, or you source your first 5 to 10 candidates. And maybe sometimes you might run into some misalignment where we're a little off base on what we're looking for. So what's that rhythm look like with your hiring managers?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So I think part of what the struggle can be for some companies is that it is really hard to do what we do at a big scale. But because of the size we are, we're still able to give a lot of attention to our hiring managers. So we use Teams here. We're Microsoft everything at Semperis, right? So We're on Teams all the time with them. They're welcome to contact us anytime that they want. It's not like talk to me only once a week, you know? We talk all the time. And then there are other hiring managers that do want just a one weekly touch point, right? So we kind of customize based on the hiring manager style. Some hiring managers are very active in the hiring process here at Semperis. They want to review resumes with us. They want to read all of our notes. They want to review every single time a candidate goes through the interview process. And then other hiring managers are very happy to just kind of let us do our thing and then call them when we have the candidate for them, right? So we just go with the flow, whatever the hiring manager prefers.
Yeah, I imagine though that's a challenge though, right? To balance the very active hiring manager and a very, I don't want to say passive, but maybe more deferral-based hiring manager where they want you to run more of the process. So how do you guys make sure that you balance that in a way where you still get to the right outcome? Because essentially you're running, two different playbooks, at the same time, maybe across multiple hiring managers when you guys are scaling at the way you have been.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? The only answer I have for that is really the customization. We have to do it. Every team demands something different, right? Like if I'm hiring for a sales engineer, that interview process is so different and so much lengthier than hiring for a customer success manager. So there has to be a different playbook for different teams. I really don't think that talent acquisition has a one size fits all kind of process. Again, I've really never worked for companies that are thousands of employees, right? So maybe at those size of companies, you have to have a very uniform approach, no matter the position. But I think at our size and for also the quality of candidate we're looking for, it really does have to be customized per hiring manager, per team, per department. And we just kind of make it happen. I also do try to keep the rec load low. So the sweet spot for my teams is going to be anywhere from 6 to 10 openings at a time. If a role needs heavy sourcing, obviously I want to be closer to that 6 number. Whereas you have other companies that are having recruiters be, I don't know, like at 40 recs per time. Like I can't wrap my head around how they handle that successfully.
Yeah, it's just got to be a copy and paste hiring process at that point. So it sounds like your playbook then is more of like what you've defined and what you train managers on are really like the principles, foundations, values you have in your hiring process. And that's like the thing you need everybody to be aligned on. But then the reality is once you go into that intake and start collaborating with the hiring manager and learn more about the job, everything around that box of core principles has to be flexible and adaptable, for your team and for the hiring managers.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Got it.
Exactly.
All right. So
it's a startup, right? That's kind of a definition.
Yeah, totally. Right. I guess. Yeah. Right. That's just probably innately in the values of your organization. So I'm sure everybody's down with that. And probably one of the reasons why they, want to join a company like yours in the first place. All right. So let's go back to the team because you mentioned like some different roles and how the process varies. And you also mentioned your team and the capacity of them. Can you give me an idea of like what the makeup is of your team specifically?
Sure. So right now I have 4 recruiters that report to me. 2 of them are in Israel, 1 in Canada, and 1 in the US, based out of Dallas. And I'm really trying to have them each sort of specialize in a certain area. So, yes, technical talent acquisition partner is definitely a title that we have. Global talent acquisition partner is a title that we have. And so I'm trying to have them aligned to certain hiring managers so that they can really build that trust and build that relationship. One of the technical recruiters with me, she's been working with the same hiring managers for 3 years now. So it's pretty rare that she can't guess what they want, and that's kind of what I'm trying to build here. Even when someone new comes on board, we did have, 2 new recruiters join us just this last quarter of 2024. They jumped right in because I want them to get to know people immediately. I want people to know who they are. I want the hiring managers to trust them. And that's the type of recruiter that we also want on our team. No fear to talk to anybody and everyone, and to ask all the right questions.
Yep. Makes sense. And are you pairing them with hiring managers based on the function those hiring managers are in within the business, or how do you come up with that matching?
Yeah, good question. So it's definitely function, and it also can sometimes be regional because time zones are really difficult, right? So I do have to look at that, but it's mostly function. So in Israel, for example, one of the 2 recruiters that's there, she focuses completely on the tech industry in Israel. So it's a very competitive landscape. She's hiring software engineers. She knows the market there. And then the other one is very global. He's working throughout Europe on more go-to-market function and things like that. So it can be really both functional and regional. There's a lot of things to look at, but eventually you start to see a trend as to which positions they're better at, and which hiring managers they match with.
That makes sense. So you mentioned a couple different positions. You mentioned software engineers, you mentioned sales engineers, you mentioned customer success managers. And the hiring process for all of those is different. Is there like a baseline hiring? Like what is a typical, and I know the answer to this is there's really no typical because it's customized, but like what's the baseline? What does it generally look like to hire for you guys?
Yeah, so it is hard to say like a full interview cycle, what that looks like. But I will say that every single cycle, unless it's in Israel, starts out exactly the same. And that's with a video chat. So that's one thing that's really important to me in our recruiting team. In Israel, they do prefer a phone call. So they'll do a phone call as their first step and then a video call. But for all the rest of the world's hiring, it always starts with a video chat. We want to see you. We want to know who we're talking to. We want you to know who you're talking to, right? It's not like a call center that's reaching out to you. It's a recruiter from Semperis. So that personalized touch as your first touch point is really, really important to me. And that'll always be maintained across every department. Then the other calls could be virtual as well, always video. So no matter what the process is, the only time that you're not actually speaking to a person is if you are a software engineer in North America. You take a coding test, right, which a lot of companies do. We use Codility. That's the only time that you're not actually talking to a person face to face.
And how much of that would you say is because you guys are a distributed company yourselves and you're on video all the time, I imagine, internally? So how much does that play a role into the desire to make sure you're connecting with these candidates no matter where they're at?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it, right? So not just the fact that it's just the culture and energy that we're establishing, that we want to be connected and have FaceTime with each other. We are a distributed organization. I don't live in the same city as any of my team, for example. So everything we do together is virtual. There's a lot of people that still, even throughout all of COVID, didn't really understand how to do that. And some people that don't believe in this power of video. But it's really, really powerful. It really is totally worth it to just get on screen, talk, connect, act like you're in the same room together, right? And that makes a huge difference in the interview process too. And it's two ways, not just for us to get to know the candidate better, but for them to really see who they're going to be working with.
Absolutely. And, one of the things I noticed in leading up to this call with you is you're using video yourself on your own LinkedIn when you're talking about open roles at the company. And we talked about this a little bit before, but I think it's just a great way for people to see a person from the talent acquisition team, hear you talk, how you talk about the open roles, how you talk about the company, but more importantly, just put a face to the name and, make an authentic asynchronous connection. When did you start doing that and what drove you to start taking that initiative?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Actually, I've always been a little bit active on LinkedIn. I don't have a TikTok. I'm not super active on social media, just in my personal life in general. But I noticed, if I'm going to be really going in all in on recruiting, I should figure out this LinkedIn thing. And so I really started posting, kind of sharing, making connections with people. And then because we use LinkedIn so heavily with Semperis, with our recruiting, I got invited to the LinkedIn Talent Connect conferences. And each time I've gone, I've learned a few different things. And, the power of video is a consistent theme that comes up all the time. And I did start to think, we're always doing video chats for every single interview, right? And video is really not that big of a deal. I'm sitting here in my home office, just doing it on my computer right now. It's super easy. And so I started trying it out and giving people a taste of, what it would be like to interview with us, right? I thought that that's kind of what I was doing. That's the point. I'm not trying to be everybody's recruiter or be like this big thought leader or something. My job is to recruit for Semperis. And so I thought, I'll tell people what it's like to work at Semperis. It was really that simple.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why I started.
Yep, I think it's great. And look, you obviously you're putting new roles out there and you're trying to reach new candidates, but also there's an effect of there's previous candidates that you guys have connected with during previous hiring processes. There's previous candidates that are following you or following your company just by the nature of connecting with you guys on LinkedIn at some point historically. And so by you putting this content out there in such an authentic way, you're, in essence, pulling some of these, candidates back in because they'll see those impressions on their feed just by the nature of being connected or following you. So I imagine there's not only some pull effect of new candidates and a great way, to send a video to somebody that's applying for a role so they can get to know you maybe before they talk to you or a member of your team, but also there's an effect of pulling back in people that you guys have previously engaged with just because you're putting yourself out there. And I think really that's like a lesson for everybody is, to your point, hey, if we're going to do this recruiting thing, if we're going to be all in on hiring, if we have to grow the way that we're expected to grow by the business, then we have to be all in as a recruiting team. And we have to be putting ourselves out there and doing everything we can to be making these authentic connections with candidates so we can position ourselves as an employer of choice, but also just make sure people know about who we are and what we have to offer because there's just so much noise in the job market.
Yeah, very true. And I think one of the examples that you mentioned too is it is bringing in past candidates as well, because we do connect with them in the videos and they follow and they kind of see what's happening. They've seen our growth. There's multiple people that I just recently brought on board who I had met in 2022 when we were first going through our big hiring blitz, right? And they were kind of watching and waiting for the right position to come up, or maybe they were waiting for us to be more mature because they weren't really, brave enough to take the risk, when we were that early. So there's always a time that is right for some candidates. And if you kind of stay top of mind in that way and you make that initial connection really strong, when they're coming back and they are ready, they're going to come to you first, right? They're going to remember, wow, that was a really great experience and I want to check out what Semperis is doing.
Absolutely. So I want to go back to the hiring process that we were talking about and the fact there are different stages and those stages vary depending on the position. And, thinking about speed of the hiring process, how do you, during the intake process with hiring managers, determine what's actually needed from an interview stage standpoint and to properly evaluate our candidates so we can make a thoughtful, smart decision about who we end up making an offer to?
So one of the things that has really, I think, helped me over the last few years was I knew I was going to be focusing on recruiting or talent acquisition only in this role. And so I got to really kind of focus myself and my learning a little bit more too. And I actually really loved learning about performance-based hiring, which is, most often people hear Lou Adler's name associated with performance-based hiring, right? And so I even did some sessions with my team about it. And in our intake conversations, we try to focus the hiring manager on that as well. So I know we're hiring right now for a need. I understand that, tomorrow a project is starting and you need this person yesterday. But if this person is hired, that's a hire. That's a long-term, permanent, full-time person. So more than just the project that's starting tomorrow, what are they going to do for you in 6 months? What is this person going to be expected to do in 1 year? What is your performance review going to look like for them, right? So we're really trying to encourage them to look at it that way and then work our way backwards. And when you work your way backwards, you start to recognize which members of the teams, for lack of a better way, opinion or evaluation is going to be most impactful to knowing if that person is the right fit, right? So we actually don't do peer interviews here at Semperis. We prefer that leaders lean on each other to really select kind of the hiring team. And so when we're talking to that one hiring manager, we'll say, okay, does your leader need to interview? Do we need to have an extra technical step with maybe somebody in a cross-departmental function that works with you a lot, and we'll flush that all out in the beginning. But it's all with a longer term thought in mind.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. First of all, shout out to Luke, great guy.
He's great.
Great thought leader in the space. So first of all, I love that approach. I think that's a great way of setting expectations and really getting to, knowing what success will look like for this person when they are a long-term hire, and you kind of back your way into, okay, how do we evaluate for the skills and behavioral competencies that are needed in order to get them to that point? To your point, bringing in other leaders, I'm sure, and growing the business the way that you have, it's a highly cross-functional business. So that's why it's important to have other stakeholders involved in the process. So all that makes sense. I'm curious from a hiring manager standpoint, if we go back to the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about how you guys scaled so quickly, and a lot of it, came out of nowhere when you were obviously planning to hire a lot of people going from 140. I think you said you wanted to hire 80 people in that first year, but you get the funding in May, and now it's like, all right, it's on. We got to hire a ton more people than we thought. So now you have hiring managers that are thrusted into a process, hiring more, than they expected to, or hiring, just in general when they maybe didn't expect to hire. And so you have all these different hiring managers that are thrusted in the process. All these different hiring managers have varying levels of hiring experience.
Yes.
And therefore probably varying levels of confidence. So as you work through the process with them, you define these interview stages, you have candidates moving through. How do you prevent that, let's call it hiring manager creep, where they, the thoughts creep in that they need to know more about this candidate? It's like they've already gone through their interviews. They've already done everything you guys said you needed to do to properly evaluate candidates. But those thoughts start to creep in for the hiring manager of like, I don't want to make the wrong decision. Can I talk to this person again? Maybe we should do this again. Maybe we should have this person in the company talk to them. I'm sure that happens for you guys all the time. How do you manage that?
It does. There are definitely some hiring managers, we love to call it FOMO, right? They want to see like anybody and everybody that's on the market. I still very much push with my team that I prefer quality over quantity. So I'd much prefer that they're bringing 5 super strong candidates that are hitting the mark than have the hiring manager meet 10 people just because he or she wants to meet 10 people, right? But I will say, based on what you're describing, I like to kind of call it like the magical debrief. So at the end of the process, you've had maybe 3 candidates that made it all the way through to the final stage, and everybody loved them in the same way. I actually literally just had this happen like last week with one of my recruiters, and we were kind of coaching through it. She had 4 candidates who all scored 4s. That's the top of like what we score. And she's like, we have to hire somebody. What's going on here? And so I told her, I said, get the debrief going. You put a debrief together. You all get into one room or one Zoom room, right? And you just say what you feel or what you think about each candidate's evaluation. You look very, objectively at all of the feedback and come to that decision together. And that kind of takes the pressure off of the hiring manager from feeling like they're going to make a terrible decision and everything's on their shoulders. It's not. It's a hiring team. There were 3 other people in the process with you. It's not just your decision. So in the debrief, sharing your feedback openly and verbally rather than just reading it on paper makes a huge difference. And often we've done that, right? Like you have some candidates who are really very, very equal and you have to pick one. Get the debrief going, right? The magical debrief. There's always going to be a decision. You don't leave that debrief without a decision.
That was my next question is how do you make sure you don't leave that meeting with no decision?
You don't leave that debrief without an action item, at least. So I shouldn't say without a decision. So there are times where even in that debrief, you kind of still debate and might not agree, in which case you should have an action item at the end of the debrief. So maybe the action item is like, okay, we do need one more person to talk to this. Oh, or maybe there was a flag that came up, Anna, hey, can your recruiting team just like talk to them one more time, kind of ask a few questions. Maybe we'll do a reference check and we'll kind of dig into XYZ and that'll help me make my choice, right? But either way, there has to be an action item that's going to lead to the decision. Otherwise, you're dragging it out for no reason.
Totally. Yeah, I agree with that. You need to walk out of there with some action item that has some clear owner and clear deadline for when we need to actually get this done by, because to your point, you just can't let it drag out. But I think the most important thing, as you mentioned, is ultimately you want to get to the best decision. So if you get into that debrief and ultimately you're still in a tie and you need to go gather this very specific data point in order to get you over the hump to make that decision, then you go do it. But you got to walk out of there at least with an owner that knows how quickly they need to get said thing done. So you don't have candidates just like waiting around for the next step and you potentially lose the people that are the tiebreaker.
Right.
In the first
and then
place.
Start all over again. That has definitely happened before as well. I will be honest. Candidates are interviewing in multiple places and it's just inevitable. It can definitely happen that you come down to 2, but it's 2 really strong, really impressive people that other companies also think are very strong and impressive. And if you wait too long, you could potentially lose them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that happens all the time at companies. That's like the hiring managers waffling on the decision, but that's why you need things in place for when that scenario arises. Like if we go back again, like I think one of the things that you mentioned, and I think one of the things that's led to a lot of your success in your recruiting career is your experience working in all these companies, specifically in all areas of their operations and learning how to put together really methodical processes. And part of building a methodical process is thinking about all the points of failure so we can address those before they become a point of failure. So oftentimes the tiebreaker scenario can become a point of failure because we end up waffling on a decision. And then next thing you know, both candidates that we were trying to decide upon have taken other offers. And to your point, you're back at square one. So having a process, you call it the magical debrief, by which you go and break those ties is really important. How also, though, at the beginning of the process, when you're doing the intake, are you aligning with the hiring manager on the criteria, right? So I think it's very easy to post a job and say, here are all the requirements, and you Googled it, or maybe the hiring manager wrote the list and you haven't, gone through it with a lot of rigor. And then you get to the end of the process and you're like, well, the candidates all match these requirements in varying levels. One candidate is better at this, whereas the other candidate's better at that. And then it's really hard to make an objective decision. So how do you align on like, what are the true must-haves? What are the nice to haves? And then the order of which you would prioritize those nice to haves to make a decision in a tiebreaker.
Yeah, that's a good question. So often that will come down to the hiring manager, but the recruiter kind of has to guide them in that thought process, because we'll present, what's available. We're going to show you what's in the market. We're going to bring you a bunch of different options there, but they might have to decide what they're willing to compromise on. And I think that kind of goes also back to performance-based hiring and just looking at hiring as a big picture in general as to, what pieces of the puzzle we're adding in. So even when I've been hiring for my own team, which, I don't like the word weakness, but like which area of weakness am I trying to fulfill here? And which area of strength can I kind of like give on a little bit that I don't need in this next person that I hire, right? So you kind of have to think of it as a puzzle. You're sticking a piece into the puzzle. You're not trying to find clones of each other when you're finding candidates for a particular position, right? So hopefully that answers your question a little, but that's kind of the point.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, what happens all the time is recruiters collaborate with the hiring manager on the requirements, and the hiring manager wants to tell you all these things that they absolutely need. But then the reality is you start hiring, you send over some candidate profiles to them, and they're like, yeah, that wouldn't be good. And you're like, wait a second, but they don't have X, Y, and Z that you said were a must have. They're like, yeah, well, they have the comparable thing. It's like, okay, well, now we're not really aligned on what is truly needed for somebody to be successful in this role and what we can give on and what we can't give on. And so I think making that really clear early on is super important.
Making it clear early on, but also having touch points throughout the process is really important. So like what you just mentioned, right? So you kind of have to have that touch point throughout the process. Like, hey, I know that when we first set out our intake call, this is what we thought the profile would be, but I'm finding, XYZ in the market. Is this okay with you? Maybe we want to find someone that has more of this. And it is kind of a dance you do together, right? To find the right mix.
Talk to me a little bit about the importance of culture fit for you guys, because going from 140 people to 500 plus, things naturally will just change in the culture when you scale at that type of level and you just go from one size to the next. So how have you guys integrated assessing for culture fit into your hiring process and gotten alignment on what's actually important to assess for?
Honestly, the video connections contribute very heavily, I think, to our success in culture fit hiring. Because it's not always like culture fit, right? It's kind of culture add and, just bringing different flavors and different quirks and different energies to the team that also fit. So that's really what we're looking for when we're doing a video chat. We're not just immediately asking you about your skills. How many years have you done this? How many, have you used C#? Like, that's not a great question, So what we're really asking in our screenings is, what are you looking for from a company? And you can tell so much about a person from that response, right? From the way that they respond to that question. What do you need from your manager? These very like open-ended questions that show you a little bit of the person, not just the employee. And that's really what we look for kind of during our HR steps. And then also the hiring managers are seeking it as well. So there are a lot of different ways that you can ask certain questions when you're doing an interview process that can kind of give you a peek into the person. And at Semperis, we're really just looking for genuinely good people. Like, that's it. Just be yourself, be a good person, and you'll pass the culture test. It's really not that hard or not that complicated. But I think a lot of times candidates think they have to put on this like persona and be like super buttoned up and professional and everything. Like, that's not this company.
You bring up a really good point too. I think not only are you guys trying to learn that about the candidate is also trying to learn that about you. And I think often companies will focus so much on assessing the candidate without offering up much to allow the candidate to assess them.
Yeah.
And that probably is where downstream most things actually fail, where it doesn't work out. It's because the company wasn't a good fit for the candidate, and we didn't do a good enough job as a company in giving the candidate the right information to make that decision themselves. And so I find that there's more of the misalignment that actually happens with that versus the other way around, because there's so much emphasis on just assessing the candidate with those cultural behavioral questions. And so it's like the hiring team gets a really good feel for that, but did the candidate really get a good feel for if your environment, if the way you guys manage, if the way you guys collaborate is really a good dynamic for them? And so I think that's something that's super important to convey during the hiring process. How are you guys messaging that to candidates early and often?
Yeah, so I think it's just in all the questions that we ask too, all the conversations, always making sure that you're paying attention to the time and leaving a few minutes for them to ask us questions. If ever I run out of time on a scheduled screening, I'll say like, let's schedule more time. I'm sure that you have some questions for me. I'm so sorry that we ran over, stuff like that. Just showing them that you also care about their time and effort and want to give them the opportunity to get to know you is super important. And that's really easy. That's really easy, taking 10 more minutes to answer some questions for somebody. Yeah. And so that's really important to me. And I always try to reflect that to the hiring managers, make sure that you leave time for questions and then have the interview be conversational. It's a two-way street, right? Don't make it feel like it's this rapid fire interrogation. There's always opportunity for people to insert, their opinion or their thoughts too into a conversation if you set the tone from the beginning. So I think that's really, really important. Just the way that you start the conversation is so essential.
Totally. I think it's often misunderstood that all the power lies with the employer in the experience, right? It's like they're the ones making the decision. The reality is the candidate's making a decision too. So I think the earlier you can make an authentic connection, to your point, and level set with the candidate that, hey, I want this to be a mutual fit if we get to the end of the line here. And so power is with both of us. And so I want to give you the information that you need in order to make the best decision for you. And vice versa. That's why we're asking questions and going through the interview process, so we get the information to make a good decision for us. And if at the end of this process, there's good alignment and we've all asked the questions we need to ask, that probably bodes well for that person being with the company for a long period of time.
Yes, that's very accurate.
This has been great. I've learned so much. You have a lot of stuff going on. Obviously, you've accomplished a lot over the last few years. And I'm just so impressed by the way that you guys run your hiring process, the way you guys build relationships with your candidates and your hiring managers. You guys are truly doing what every talent acquisition team can be doing. And I think you guys are really good stewards of the hiring process and nurturing all those relationships, giving people the information they need, making sure hiring managers feel prepared. And at the end of the day, there are all those stakeholders to manage. And that's just what's required if you want to run a good hiring process now and, for years into the future. So thanks so much for sharing all of your insights today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really fun.